Hello, I am John O'Brien, Head of Communications with MCC Brussels, and welcome to another edition of Deep Dives. Deep Dives is the series where we take a more in-depth look at the research, analysis and reports produced by MCC Brussels. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Ashley Frawley, visiting research fellow with MCC Brussels, and to talk about her new report. Her new report is Mission Creeps: How EU Funding and Activist NGOs Captured the Gender Agenda. Thank you very much for joining us today, Ashley.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, this report caused quite a stir when it was released. You went with me to the European Parliament on the invitation of MEPs to actually hear some of the thinking about gender self-ID and some of these complicated questions. The MEPs wanted to hear what was in your report. And there was protests outside that tried to close down the meeting from LGBTQI activists. Now, tell me what's going on there. Why would they be trying to silence what's in this report?
Well, I think what a lot of people have come to realize is that part of the reason why no one wants to talk about LGBTIQ, and really it's the TIQ that's causing most of the stir, is because once it's out in the open, once it's out there, it is laid bare for how incredibly strange and nonsensical the movement is. And as I talk about in my report, part of what made it so powerful as a movement, this sort of gender identity movement, is that it was successful in piggybacking on issues that most people didn't have a problem with. Mm-hmm. So, I think most people have a vague recollection that we had gay marriage and there was this big celebration of gay rights. And then out of nowhere, there was the trans movement and you couldn't say anything about it. And it was kind of, again, piggybacking on, the popularity of the gay rights movement, where if they had the gay cake thing, and people were kind of okay with society has said this is kind of okay. And if you are against that, then you're outside society. And so then they tried to say, well, it's really the same thing. It's just another way to be gay. And so if you're against that, then you're outside society. And we had cancel culture and this sort of thing. But people gradually started realizing, I don't think this is just another way to be gay. There's something profoundly different here. And they start speaking up and asking questions, and they get shunned from public life, utterly shunned. And it's just not working anymore. Mm-hmm. It's just not working anymore. It's come to a peak. It's critical mass, and everyone's saying this makes no sense. So those people lined up, unfortunately, couldn't stop us from speaking because people want to hear what we have to say. Everybody knows it's not going to work.
Your report suggests that the original goals of gender equality, which I think most normal people wouldn't disagree with, have been overtaken by something entirely different. When we use the word gender today, what do you think people believe it means, and how has that meaning been strategically blurred?
Yeah, so the word gender has a long history. Obviously, I cover this in my report. But for most people, when they hear it, they think women, because it had become a shorthand for women. And therefore, if you are against gender identity, which is something completely different, eons of women were not oppressed because they had an innate sense that they were women. They were oppressed because of their biological difference from men and what that meant in the social world. And so people started to say, oh, no, you're anti-gender. So if you question this, you're anti-gender, meaning you're anti-women. And that has been an incredible little sleight of hand. So it's sort of painting anyone who's against the gender identity agenda as anti-women's rights.
I've noticed this, especially with the NGOs of the Brussels bubble. They throw out these reports saying the anti-gender movement. And I was confused because I'm I'm not against gender. I'm just raising issues about the TQI movement, who's twisted gender into a women's rights perspective so that they can maybe have broader support for their extremist agenda.
Yeah, and this is what has enraged a lot of, feminists and women who've been fighting for women's rights for a really long time, because it is not just sort of piggybacked on, use this word gender and radically changed its meaning without anybody noticing. It actually overtook the agendas that were meant to be, that were in place when gender was a shorthand for women. So the gender equality strategy, the LGBTIQ equality strategy, it radically redefines gender, but it was so smart in a way because, without anybody noticing, you've got gender mainstreaming that countries sign up to, and what they signed up to was to support women's rights. But when you sort of tack on, well, actually gender means gender identity, then everybody must, you sign on to, when you come into the European Union, you sign on to supporting gender identity, essentially. And then this undermines women's rights.
That's the mission creep that
That's the mission creep. Yes, exactly.
Ironically, you argue that policies intended to protect minorities have sparked a backlash that now threatens the broader gender equality movement. Why do you think this unintended consequences hasn't been acknowledged by people in the EU institutions who I imagine do care about women?
I'm not sure they do care about women. I don't think they care about real, actual women and the struggles that they go through, and the fact that they are mothers and want to be mothers a lot of the time, God forbid. I think that they want a kind of woman who's going to take up low-paid work and get the economy going, this sort of thing. They like the kind of woman who lives up to a feminine stereotype, who's passive, docile, doesn't ask for more money in the workplace, this sort of thing. That's the kind of femininity that they like, not women. And they want men to be that too. So that's a big part of the gender agenda is, so when you say you're not anti-gender, I think actually the gender agenda without identity has some problems with it that have ironically been quite contra women's rights. And you can find more about that in my report, Family in Fragments, about how women in their role as mothers is really sort of degraded. But in terms of the fight for women's rights and, gender equality and, LGB, there's been enormous rollback. And I'm afraid that's because what often happens is when the other side calls you something, instead of saying, no, you're wrong, and articulating a position, a lot of people go, yeah, so what? They don't sort of have a powerful foundation, except that they're in opposition. And I think it's so important to think through your position. So when the opposition has called us, people like us, anti-gender, what they're sort of trying to, paint you with this broad brush of being really backward. And instead of thinking, well, no, look, I don't have a problem with women making choices and this sort of thing. I don't have a problem, to work or not to work. And I'm vaguely in favor. What's all this? It's like, yeah, so what? And then you have this enormous rollback. You have this enormous, I'm against it all. I don't want any of it. And you get rollback, when most people were okay with gay rights. Yeah, do what you do in your own privacy of your own home, whatever. And now it's like, there's a rollback across anything that has to do with LGBTIQ.
The report describes a growing crisis of legitimacy within the EU. Do you see gender policy as a symptom of deeper structural issues in how the EU makes decisions and engages with citizens?
Absolutely. I think what the main sort of finding of the report is this enormous amount of money that's going into these NGOs. And it is...
That's our money. That's our taxpayer money.
Yeah, you are paying to have your children taught in school about the gender unicorn and all the wonderful ways in which you can, be many, many different genders, and it's completely, and it's absolutely mad because, don't get me started. It's absolutely mad about what they're doing in education and in Portugal, how far things have gone where, it's just one example where students are transitioning in school. They won't tell the parents. And if they don't have to tell the parents. And if you as a parent have a problem with this, you can have your children taken away. And this has happened. And so you're paying for that. And you had no idea. Most people had no idea this was happening until their kids came home and started talking about it. until there were men and women's sports and this sort of thing. It just all happened in such a clandestine way. Why? Well, I mentioned before that there was piggybacking, but the EU was pouring enormous amounts of funding. They funded these groups to be embedded in the Brussels bubble, to be part of the everyday policymaking process. They give these from 25 years ago, just about. They were giving these groups core funding.
Can you actually give us an idea from your report? What sort of money are we talking about?
It is astronomical. And I have to say that we were being kind. We could have been much more inclusive. So we found at least 220 million euros of EU funds going to NGOs that are broadly in favor of the gender identity agenda, that have been involved in projects that are, pushing gender identity in schools, that push for gender self-ID, that have been basically, uploaded their policies, their desired policies straight into EU policy, basically as written, redefined homosexuality to mean same gender attraction, just utterly erasing homosexuals. And this was all funded with enormous funds. And we just scratched the surface, because one of the things that I found was, when you look deeper at these organizations, there are so many organizations that on the surface have nothing to do with gender, that are involved in, embedding gender identity in education, that are involved in, foreign aid and educating people in African countries about gender identity. It's the tentacles are so far reaching, and it is so well funded, and it is your money.
The examples in the report, and I'd really encourage those watching this podcast to go to the notes section, read this report. The examples are shocking. The figures, my taxpayer money going on this type of lunacy, is shocking as well. And it's all seems to be done very quietly, silently, not really shining a light on it. And your report does shine a light on it. You say this is no longer about equality, but about ideological adherence. How would you respond to critics who argue that you're overstating this, that perhaps seeing authoritarianism where others see progress? How about, you see something that's quite dark in this? Tell me why.
Well, one of the things that people continuously ask me is why? Why are they pushing? Why do elites care so much about gender identity? And it is obviously something so big and so profoundly impactful. It doesn't have one simple explanation. But I don't think it is at all overstating the case to say that it is about ideological adherence and conformity, but it's also about a radical rethinking of what it means to be a citizen, which has been rethought along gender lines. And I sort of alluded to this before, where the ideal subject is no longer the sort of Enlightenment subject who is, I'm a sociologist, so I've read decades of sociology that talks about the Enlightenment subject was actually just a straight white male. Well, it was. Sure, maybe it was coded male, but I'm afraid I find it highly insulting to say that it is uncharacteristic of me that I could be just because I'm a woman, that I could be rational, stoic, reasonable, reflecting on myself and rationally choosing how to act. This was the basis of our liberal democratic societies. Yeah. That's been rejected as too masculine. And what we need is a feminized subject who's emotive and closer to nature, which is, all these things that women had fought against as highly insulting, and which were reasons and were things that kept us out of public life. Now they're saying, hey, ladies, do you know what? That's great. And men, too, you should be like that as well. You should recognize that you're actually irrational and that we should insulate democracy from this irrationality. So I think it's a quite complex argument to make, but I do talk about it in my broader writing, that I think there's a deeper shift in what it means to be a citizen, and it is being restructured along gendered lines in the sense of wanting a citizen who is more passive, more pliant, careful about what they say, looks for the frameworks and and the guides. How am I supposed to behave? Well, look, this person tells me their pronouns. They tell me exactly what I am supposed to say. And as a good citizen, I will say these pronouns. I will behave in this way. I will be deferential. That is the subject that is wanted. Now, that's just a small part of what's going on here, but I think that it is about, if you adhere to that, you are a good citizen.
You argue that most people support a live and let live attitude, yet their tolerance is being exploited. How do you distinguish between genuine tolerance and what you call a Trojan horse for ideology?
It's actually really sad because the older trans movement had been making a lot of leaps and bounds in the sense live and let live. You want to dress as a woman? That's all right. And if you passed, which was always the sort of issue within, transitioning in the literature on transitioning, it was, the difficulty of passing. But if you passed, people didn't notice. So it was kind of fine. But what has happened is that it's actually rather bigoted if you think about it. You have to kind of pretend that you see in front of you a real thing that has actually transmogrified. So instead of saying, this is a man who, for whatever reason, wishes to be seen as a woman while moving through the world, but isn't really a woman. And that's okay. Instead of saying that, it was like, you are literally a woman. Something very literal has happened here. I don't see a man in a dress. I see a beautiful woman, which is actually really
crazy,
mad because they can't accept, this person might wish to wear a dress. They just cannot accept that. I can't accept a man who's gender nonconforming. Oh, God, no. It has to be a woman, a true woman. And the fact that it is so ludicrous acts as a kind of test. By pretending you believe in it, you signal that, as I mentioned before, you signal that you are a good citizen. I am not a danger. I am not a risk. I am pliant. I am pacifiable. And the people who are unwilling, who point and say, the emperor is not wearing any clothes, they signify that they are dangerous. They are dangerous citizens. And that has to be controlled. But I think that live and let live attitude was actually quite a progressive thing. It was just sort of what you do in your personal life, as long as it doesn't impinge on me, I don't mind. But the idea that it is the necessity that it has now crossed over into a kind of fundamental belief system means that it has even more power to have enormous effects on society. Obviously, women's sports is the example, but there are examples of men in women's change rooms who obviously got a sexual thrill out of it.
Yeah.
And at the very, the sort of spa example, was it Spa example a few years back, where initially the women this man exposed himself to them. For the purpose of sexual thrill, they were dismissed as prudes.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm really happy that your report came out is that I hear from a lot of people, hey, why are you making a fuss about this? Who really cares about it? But when you listen to the feminists and the women's rights activists who really have been looking at this, there's a real and present danger for children and for women's rights. This is an attack upon children, and especially from a women's rights perspective, I'm shocked that the EU institutions are tone deaf to what's going on and blind to what's happening. They're turning the other way. They're turning their backs on women. Even women's rights organizations are not standing up for women. I'm talking about the official funded EU women's rights organizations. What's going on that with this degree of capture? I'm wondering if we're going to rebuild trust, restore clarity on gender policy, where should we start? What role should national governments, citizens, and even NGOs, good NGOs, if there's any of them left, what role can they play in getting us back on track again so that women's rights and children's rights are protected from this lunacy?
Well, they have to tell the truth. You have to be brave and tell the truth. And also just be wary that we don't need to roll back on everything. We do need to have an open conversation, because this is what happened. When you sort of push people out of society, it's like, well, I'm out of society anyway. So you can go down rabbit holes. And I think that's not helpful for any kind of movement that wants to be a serious opposition to something so powerful. Like, we need to be rational and think, what exactly is the problem here? And the only way that we can do that is through open conversations with each other instead of sort of canceling each other. But, it's a very common strategy that people will say, that won't happen. Okay, it'll happen, but it's just a small thing. oh, it's happening, but you deserve it. It's a good thing, actually. And this is what we've seen, with the sort of, trans women in women's sports, where it's like, that's not going to happen. Nobody would do that. And it's like, oh, well, it's just a small thing. And then it's like, actually, it's something to be celebrated, and it's just so shameful. Or with children, oh, nobody's transitioning children. That's not actually happening. And then you hear all these stories of the terrible effects of puberty blockers, and the sort of medical pathways. And so, oh, well, that's happening, but it's actually just a small thing. And then people they're coming of age now, and they're realizing what's happened to their bodies, and they're very upset about it. And it's like, well, they were wrong about their gender identities, and actually they're a problem, and they deserve it because they should have known better. And that's so awful, the way that these people are blamed. You should have known better. Well, they were told, trust the doctors. The doctors know. And then it's like, well, actually, that was your fault. You shouldn't have trusted. It's just really sad.
We've talked about women and how women are affected by this. What's the effect on children?
Well, the effect on children has been absolutely enormous. And one of the targets of a lot of this lobbying and a lot of the movement around, gender identity has been children. And that's partially because we see children as sort of symbols of innocence, and, they're unsullied by socialization, by society and social norms. And so if they're saying that they're trans, well, that's it. It must be real. It must be a real thing. But what we have learned through, terrible past incidents like, the satanic panic from the 80s and 90s is that children are incredibly suggestible, and they really want to please adults. And that can lead them down really terrible paths, and has led us down terrible paths as a society in the past, where people knew that what children were saying couldn't possibly make sense. But they said, listen to the children, because what monster wants to say those children are lying? But of course, it's not that they're malevolently lying, it's that they want to please people, and they take in your whole function as a child is to become socialized, become part of your culture, to learn its rules. And you're sitting there saying, this is in our culture, here are all the ways that you can express this innate gender identity, which has no scientific basis. And the children that I have an innate gender identity, which may be any one of these things, and so it's incredibly suggestible, and it's just the most obvious thing. But the fact that it reminds me so much of the satanic panic, we're doing it again. But the other thing, too, is just even outside of children who are being, encouraged into this world, it's the effect on young girls. I have two daughters, and I am constantly 6 and 8 years old, and I'm constantly trying to protect them. I worry about them going out into the world. I worry about, male predators, this sort of thing. And I have to kind of tell them, as women, we're taught to be nice. We're taught to be nice, to consider other people's feelings. And that can kind of lead to awkward situations. And I got to tell them, no, you got to stand up for yourself. But when it comes to this, if they see someone that makes them uncomfortable, or they see someone who's clearly a male appearing as a woman in their spaces, I have to tell them, oh, your discomfort here actually doesn't matter. What matters is the man's feelings. What a horrible lesson.
Absolutely.
How on earth are parents supposed to negotiate that, let alone children? It's a rollback of so much that we have tried to teach women, to learn as women, to grow as women, to stand up for ourselves. Like, actually, in this case, the man's feelings are what matter.
I think we're going to see a lot more detransitioners.
Oh, yeah.
Sadly,
we already are.
Tragically, as these years go by. And maybe their voices will be very helpful in changing back the tide that is really going against women and the rights of children. Ashley Frawley, thank you very much for joining us today. I think your research is really important, and I'd encourage anybody who's watching this podcast, this is a report that you need to read. It has the facts, the figures, the things that are happening behind closed doors at the EU on gender. And if you care about kids, if you care about women's rights, this is a report that really is worth your time. Thank you very much for joining us on Deep Dives. I look forward to seeing you again. This is John O'Brien signing off for MCC Brussels.